I don't need you anymore, Margaret. Pack your things and get out. Her voice cut through the living room like a cold Atlantic wind. The morning sun poured in through the big bay window, turning every dust mote into a tiny shard of light. My suitcase, already half-zipped, sat on the floor where she had tossed it. I stood there, hands trembling around the mug of coffee I hadn't tasted. It had gone cold, the rim smelling faintly of blueberry pie from breakfast. Daniel stood behind her, eyes fixed on the floor, lips pressed tight like he was holding back something, or nothing at all. $8 million. That's what the lottery ticket in her purse was worth. A ticket bought 2 weeks ago with a $20 bill I'd handed her at the gas station, telling her to fill the tank. I thought I was buying gas. I didn't know I was buying my eviction notice. She stepped closer, the sharp scent of her floral perfume cutting through the salt air drifting from the open window. "You've been a burden long enough," she said, almost smiling. The words slid into me deeper than any knife. I looked around the room, the couch I'd helped choose, the rug I'd paid for, the roof over our heads I had patched last winter when the wind ripped it open. Every corner of that house had my fingerprints. And yet, here I was erased. Part of me wanted to shout. Another part wanted to laugh, because there was something absurd about losing everything in the same breath that she gained it all. But mostly, I felt a slow, rising heat in my chest. A heat that had nothing to do with anger, and everything to do with resolve. Daniel finally lifted his head. "Lala," he began, but his voice faded as she turned her glare on him. "Don't," she said. "This is my house now." I set the mug down on the coffee table, careful not to spill. The wood was warm from the sunlight, smooth from years of polishing, years I had done without complaint. The walls seemed to lean in, listening. I could hear the faint hum of the fridge, the ticking of the old clock above the doorway, the gulls outside calling over the sound of waves against the breakwater. I took a breath that tasted of coffee, salt, and something bitter. "I see," I said quietly. Lila crossed her arms. "You'll leave today. I want my freedom. I want my life the way I deserve it." I almost asked her what she thought she deserved. But instead, I let my gaze drift to Daniel. He couldn't meet my eyes. The house felt colder, though the sun hadn't moved. I thought of the day I sold my little place after Robert died, putting nearly all the money into this home so Daniel could have room for his family, so I could hear grandchildren's footsteps on the stairs, so I wouldn't be alone. And here I was, suitcase on the floor, being told I had overstayed my welcome. I bent down, zipped it the rest of the way, and straightened slowly. The sound of the zipper was loud in the silence. I could have fought right there. I could have told her about the $20, about the gas station, about the receipt in my wallet, but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I walked to the door, each step sinking into the rug we'd picked out together. The brass doorknob was warm from the morning sun. I paused with my hand on it, feeling the weight of years in my palm. Over my shoulder, I saw her already turning away, phone in hand, no doubt picturing her new life. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I still held something more valuable than their $8 million. The truth. Folks, what would you do if the people you sacrificed everything for told you to leave, right after they struck gold? Would you walk away or would you fight for what's yours? The summer of 2020 still lingers in my mind like a photograph left too long in the sun, faded at the edges, but warm at the center. Rockport was alive that year. The gulls screamed over the harbor, and the air smelled of salt and fresh paint from the boats lined up along the dock. My little house, the one Robert and I had bought after our wedding, sat at the end of a quiet lane. White clapboard siding, blue shutters, and a porch that creaked underfoot. Every board had a memory nailed into it. I sold it in July. Daniel had called a week before. "Mom, we found a place near the water. Enough room for all of us. You'd have your own room, big kitchen, even a garden." His voice had that boyish hope I could never resist. I imagined mornings with my grandchildren in the garden, evenings in a kitchen filled with steam and the smell of bread baking. The loneliness of the last 2 years would finally ease. Selling my home was harder than I admitted. I spent nights packing dishes Robert and I had chosen together, folding quilts I'd sewn on winter evenings. The smell of cedar from the linen chest clung to my hands. When I signed the papers, the pen felt heavy, the ink darker than it should have been. But I told myself this was the right choice. Daniel's family needed space and I needed theirs. The day we moved into the new house, the wind carried the scent of seaweed through the open windows. Leela stood on the porch, phone in hand, giving short directions to the movers. She didn't smile at me, but I brushed it off. We were all tired. I unpacked my kitchen boxes first. The ceramic mixing bowl Robert had given me one Christmas sat in the center of the counter. I imagined teaching my granddaughter how to make blueberry muffins in it. The idea filled me with a quiet joy. That week I paid the first round of bills, electric, water, insurance, before Daniel even saw them. It felt natural. I had the money, and they had the children to think about. When the roof leaked after a September storm, I called the repairman, handed him my check, and made hot cocoa for everyone while he worked. It wasn't about keeping score. It was about keeping a family whole. Back then, I didn't notice the way Lila avoided eye contact when I mentioned repairs or bills. I didn't hear the coolness in her, "Thank you," or the way Daniel's shoulders tightened. I just thought, this is how you build a safe harbor. You give what you can, and trust the tide will carry kindness back to you. By autumn, the new house had settled into a rhythm. Mornings began with the kettle whistling and the soft thud of little feet on the stairs. I'd stand at the stove, spatula in hand, watching the fog drift in from the harbor. The children would come in with hair tousled, voices still scratchy from sleep, and I'd feel that old ache of purpose return. I planted mums along the front walkway in October, their gold and rust colors bright against the gray clapboards. Daniel helped me carry the heavy bags of soil. Leela stayed inside scrolling on her phone, saying she wasn't the gardening type. I told myself it didn't matter. Not everyone shared the same hobbies. Sometimes I'd find her in the kitchen after lunch, a faint crease between her brows as she looked over the grocery list I'd written. "Do we really need all this?" she'd ask. Tapping her manicured finger on the paper, I'd smile and explain it was for the family dinner for the pie the kids loved. She'd nod, but her eyes would slide away. In November, a storm knocked out the power. We lit candles, and I made sandwiches by flashlight. Daniel joked about camping indoors. The children huddled under quilts on the living room floor. Lila sat apart, scrolling again, the glow of her phone a cold light against the warm candle flames. Still, I believed these were just small differences, the kind that faded with time. The house echoed with laughter often enough, and the sight of Daniel reading to the kids at night was a comfort. One afternoon, I found an envelope on the hall table addressed to Leela. It was from a credit card company I didn't recognize. I placed it neatly by her purse, thinking nothing of it. Later, when I passed the kitchen, her voice was low and quick, speaking into the phone. She stopped when she saw me, her smile a little too tight. In December, Daniel asked if I could cover the heating bill, just this once, because things were tight after the holidays. I agreed without hesitation. It was what mothers did. I didn't realize, standing there with the checkbook in my hand, that I was also writing the first lines of a story I'd never imagined for my own life. A story where warmth could hide the first shadows of cold. The first cut came on a Saturday morning in late January, sharp and clean. Before I even had my second cup of coffee, the kitchen was crowded with the smell of bacon sizzling and the chatter of voices. Daniel had invited 2 of his coworkers over for breakfast, something he rarely did. I was glad. I thought it would be a chance to make the house feel welcoming, to show that warmth still lived here. I stood at the stove, flipping pancakes, the steam clouding my glasses. The sunlight spilled across the counter, catching the golden edges of the stack already plated. Behind me, Leela leaned against the fridge, mug in hand, wearing that silky robe she liked to parade around in when guests were present. Her friends, women I didn't know, sat at the table, nails painted a sharp crimson, talking about new restaurants and boutique shops in town. I poured batter onto the hot griddle, the air filling with the sweet smell of vanilla. Then I heard Leela's voice, loud enough to cut through the hum. "Margaret's good at kitchen stuff. That's really all she can do now." The words landed with a strange weight, heavier than the clang of the spatula on the pan. I kept my eyes on the bubbling circles of batter. My hand tightened on the handle, knuckles whitening. One of the women gave a polite laugh, the kind people give when they're not sure if they should. Daniel said nothing. He just reached for his coffee, eyes on the table. I slid a pancake onto the plate, the steam curling upward, and turned to place it in front of one of the guests. My smile felt stiff as if it belonged to someone else. "That's not all I can do," I said evenly, my voice calm but cool. "I also know how to patch a roof, balance a budget, and raise a family without losing my manners." Silence. The kind that stretches just long enough to become noticeable. Leela sipped her coffee, her eyes never leaving mine. "Of course, I didn't mean anything by it," she said, tone dripping with innocence. "We'd just appreciate the help. Help, as though I were a hired hand in my own home." I turned back to the stove, the hiss of bacon loud in my ears. My heart thudded not from the heat, but from the realization that this wasn't just an offhand remark. It was a line being drawn. As I worked, memories pressed in. The bills I'd paid without question, the repairs I'd arranged, the nights I'd stayed up with the children when they were sick so Daniel and Leela could sleep. All those moments now reduced to a footnote in her conversation. One of Daniel's friends tried to change the subject, asking about the harbor in winter. I answered politely, describing the ice that formed along the docks, the way the gulls still cried overhead even on the coldest mornings. My voice was steady, but my mind was elsewhere. After breakfast, as the guests bundled into their coats and Daniel walked them to the door, I began clearing plates. Leela lingered, watching me from the doorway. "You know, you don't have to take everything so seriously," she said. I stacked the plates, the porcelain cool under my fingers. "I take respect seriously," I replied. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Well, maybe you should lighten up. Times change, people change." She turned and left before I could answer. The kitchen felt empty after that, the scent of breakfast still hanging in the air like a reminder. I washed the dishes slowly, the water running hot over my hands, steam rising into my face. Outside, the gulls called again, their voices sharp against the gray sky. It struck me then. This was only the beginning. If she was willing to belittle me in front of others, she would find other ways, bigger ways, and I would have to decide, sooner than I'd planned, how much I was willing to endure. The snow had been falling since morning, soft flakes clinging to the bare branches outside the kitchen window. I was at the table, sorting through a pile of mail, the smell of tomato soup simmering on the stove curling around me. Leela swept in without a coat, cheeks flushed from the cold. She carried a slim folder, the edges of the papers inside just visible. "Margaret, could you sign these real quick? It's just some insurance updates for the house." Her tone was brisk, like a waitress delivering the check. She set the folder in front of me, flipping it open to a flagged page. A pen appeared in her manicured hand, poised over the signature line. I pushed my reading glasses higher on my nose. "What exactly am I signing?"
She gave a quick smile.
"Just standard forms. The policy needed updating after the storm repairs last year. Nothing complicated." My eyes skimmed the dense print. The words blurred together, clauses about ownership, beneficiaries, payment authorizations. A tightness formed at the back of my neck. From the stove, the soup gave a low bubble. I set down the pen and reached for the next envelope in my mail pile. A bank statement I'd almost ignored. The paper was cool against my fingers. I unfolded it slowly. There it was. A withdrawal for several $100s, dated just after New Year's. Another, smaller one a week later. Both marked from the joint account we'd opened to manage household expenses. My contribution had been most of that balance. I looked up. Leela was studying her nails, the pen still in her hand. "These withdrawals? Do you know anything about them?" I asked. Her head tilted, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face before she smoothed it away. "Household stuff. You know how it is." I did know. I also knew I hadn't authorized anything beyond the usual bills. "What kind of household stuff?" I pressed. She let out a little laugh. "Margaret, you worry too much. Send the forms and we'll be done." The pen felt heavy when I picked it up. The black ink pooled at the tip, ready to spill my name into a space I didn't yet trust. I traced the line with my eyes, my mind turning over the withdrawals, the timing, the fact she was here pushing for my signature without Daniel in the room. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window panes. The flakes whirled faster now, blurring the harbor beyond. I set the pen down again. "I'll read it over tonight?" Her smile faltered, then returned, thinner this time. "Fine. But we need it back tomorrow." She gathered her coat from the chair and left the folder on the table, the papers whispering as they shifted. I sat there, staring at my name printed beneath the blank line, wondering what exactly she needed me to give away. That night, the house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. The children were asleep, Daniel was still at work, and the only light came from the lamp on the end table beside me. The folder sat where Leela had left it, its edges slightly curled from the kitchen's warmth earlier in the day. I pulled it onto my lap and slid out the papers, the crisp shuffle sounding loud in the stillness. I started from the top, tracing each line with my finger. It wasn't just insurance updates. Buried in the legal jargon was a clause changing the primary beneficiary from Margaret Holloway to Lila Holloway. Another page authorized her to make policy changes without my consent. At the end, a paragraph granted her the right to act on my behalf in financial matters related to property upkeep. The words felt like ice under my skin. I set the papers down and reached for the bank statement again. The withdrawals I'd seen earlier glared up at me. Numbers in neat columns, but they might as well have been warning signs. My contribution siphoned off without a word. In the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed, a low, steady sound that somehow made the room feel emptier. I thought about the storm repairs she'd mentioned, how I had paid for them in full. There was no reason for my name to be moved off anything. I picked up the pen lying beside the folder, turning it between my fingers. Signing would take a second. Undoing it might take everything I had left. The floor creaked softly behind me. I turned, expecting Daniel. Instead, Leela stood in the doorway, hair loose over her shoulders, a half-smile playing on her lips. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. I placed the pen down deliberately. "Just reading. You didn't mention the beneficiary changes." Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed. "It's just paperwork, Margaret. You worry too much." I held her gaze. "Paperwork has a way of deciding who owns what." She shrugged, leaning against the doorframe. "Daniel trusts me? You should too? Trust." The word sounded hollow in the quiet room. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her footsteps muffled on the carpet. I listened until they faded, then returned my eyes to the signature line. Somewhere between the ink and the paper was the line between staying in control and losing it all. And I wasn't about to cross it. By the end of that week, the house felt colder than the winter wind outside. Daniel's greetings grew shorter, his eyes sliding past me in the hallway. Leela spoke to me only when necessary, her voice dipped in politeness so thin it nearly tore. Meals were quieter too. No more idle chatter, just the scrape of forks on plates and the occasional clink of a glass. One night, I heard their bedroom door close sharply after a low conversation in the kitchen. My name had floated up once, followed by a pause and then a whisper I couldn't catch. The walls seemed thinner these days. I started spending more time in my room, folding and refolding laundry that didn't need it, reading the same page in a book until the words blurred. The living room no longer felt like mine, even when I was alone in it. The final push came on a Saturday morning. Daniel knocked softly on my door, his hand lingering on the frame. "Mom, maybe you should take some time for yourself. A little trip, just until things settle." The words were gentle, but the message was sharp enough to leave a mark. That afternoon, I packed 2 suitcases. The ceramic mixing bowl stayed behind, as did most of my books. The house looked the same when I left, but it no longer felt like home. Seabreeze Inn was a modest place on the edge of town, just far enough that the harbor's smell reached faintly on the wind. My room had a view of the water, though the window stuck halfway when I tried to open it. The bedspread smelled faintly of detergent and salt air. Downstairs, the owner, a gray-haired woman with kind eyes, handed me a key on a heavy brass ring. For the first time in years, the only footsteps in the hall were my own. 3 days later, I stopped at the small gas station on Camden Street to buy tea and a magazine. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside. Sandy, the clerk, looked up from the counter. Her eyes widened slightly. "Margaret, I haven't seen you in a while. We chatted briefly about the weather." As I paid, she hesitated, then said, "You know, I remember the day Leela bought that lottery ticket. She was supposed to be buying gas, right?" The register's drawer slid shut with a metallic clang. My pulse quickened.
Yes,
I said carefully. "That's what I thought." Sandy nodded slowly. "I rang it up myself. She used a card, I remember, because the pump wasn't turned on after, and she bought more than one ticket." The air between us felt charged, like the moment before a storm. I could hear the soft hum of the drink cooler behind me, the faint rattle of the bell as the wind pushed against the door. I thanked her and stepped back into the cold, the words replaying in my head. She used a card. The pump wasn't turned on, and suddenly, the distance between isolation and action felt a little smaller. Back in my room at Seabreeze Inn, the door clicked shut behind me with a finality I felt in my bones. The late afternoon light slanted across the faded carpet, casting long shadows from the narrow dresser. I set the small bag from the gas station on the table by the window. The tea box inside rattled softly when I dropped my keys next to it. Outside, gulls wheeled over the gray water, their cries sharp and distant. I pulled the chair closer to the glass. watching the harbor blur and sharpen again as the wind rattled the frame. The scent of salt drifted in through the cracked window, mingling with the faint trace of detergent from the bedspread. Sandy's words circled in my head. She used a card. The pump wasn't turned on. My $20 hadn't bought gas. It had bought the ticket that changed everything. The ticket that had sent me here, to a room paid by the week, with walls thin enough to hear the neighbor's TV hum. I poured water from the kettle into a chipped mug, the steam curling toward my face. My hands were steady, though my thoughts were not. Loneliness pressed in from all sides, but beneath it was something else. A small, steady ember of possibility. If Sandy remembered, maybe someone else did too. Maybe there was a record. Maybe what felt like loss carved in stone wasn't as permanent as it seemed. The radiator clanged to life, filling the silence with its uneven rhythm. I sipped the tea, its bitterness grounding me. Across the room, my suitcases sat neatly by the wall, still zipped. I'd unpacked only what I needed. It seemed foolish to settle in when I didn't know how long I'd be here. Night came early, the sky outside my window fading from slate to black. Harbor lights winked on in the distance, their reflections trembling on the water's surface. I thought about Daniel, if he knew about the ticket's origin, if he would care. I thought about Leela, her easy confidence, her certainty that I would simply fade away. The tea cooled in my hands. I set it down, reached for the folder I'd brought from the house, the one with my bank statements and a few old receipts. My fingers brushed the edge of an envelope tucked in the back. I pulled it free. The gas station's logo was printed faintly in the corner. The date matched the day Sandy had mentioned. I sat very still, the paper between my fingers, the sound of the harbor filling the quiet. If this was the first thread, I was ready to start pulling. And I had no intention of stopping until the whole thing unraveled. The Saturday market was busy despite the wind rolling in from the harbor. Stalls lined the street, their awnings snapping in the cold breeze. The air smelled of salt, fried dough, and fresh fish laid out on beds of ice. I was at the produce stand, weighing a bag of apples, when I heard my name cut through the murmur of the crowd. Well, if it isn't Margaret. Leela's voice rang out, bright and sharp enough to make heads turn. She stood a few feet away, a basket hooked over her arm, flanked by two women from the neighborhood. I forced a polite smile. Lila. She closed the distance, the heels of her boots clicking against the wet pavement. Out shopping. Guess you still have a little cash left after everything. The pause was deliberate, a hook for anyone listening. One of the women smirked. The vendor's hands slowed over the scale. I kept my gaze on the apples. I'm managing fine. Oh, I'm sure you are, she said, her tone dripping with sweetness. Of course, you don't have to manage much anymore, do you? Not with your accommodations. The words landed like a slap. Around us, conversations quieted. I could feel the weight of eyes on my back, curious, maybe pitying. A gull screeched overhead, the sound too close, too loud. I set the apples in my basket with deliberate care. Accommodations are temporary. She tilted her head, a small smile curling her lips. Well, I suppose that's what happens when you overstay your welcome. Some people just don't know when it's time to move on. The fishmonger at the next stall shifted uncomfortably. My chest tightened, but my voice stayed even. Some people forget who made it possible for them to have a welcome in the first place. Her smile froze just for a second, then returned brighter. Always so dramatic, Margaret. Anyway, enjoy your apples. As she turned, leading her companions toward the bakery stall, laughter trailing in her wake. The sound stayed with me longer than the scent of seaweed drifting off the bay. I paid for my produce and stepped away, the paper bag warm against my palm. The chatter of the market picked back up, but the echo of her words clung like damp air. Every face I passed seemed to know the story, her version of it, at least. Near the corner of the street, I stopped to adjust my scarf. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, the screen lighting up with a message from an unfamiliar number. Margaret, this is Alvin Brooks. We need to talk about something important. Call me? For a moment, the noise of the market faded, replaced by the steady beat of my pulse in my ears. Alvin Brooks. I knew the name. Robert had mentioned him years ago, a lawyer who handled disputes nobody else wanted to touch. I slipped the phone back into my coat, the cold metal pressing against my palm. Maybe, just maybe, the tide was starting to turn. Folks, if someone humiliated you in public after taking everything, would you swallow your pride or find a way to take it back? I left the market with my scarf pulled high, the paper bag of apples cradled tight against my side. The wind off the harbor found every gap in my coat, carrying with it the mingled scents of fish and engine oil. My boots slapped against the damp pavement, each step a little heavier than the last. The crowd thinned as I turned onto a quieter street. Here, the only sounds were the gulls overhead and the distant groan of a boat shifting in its berth. I kept replaying her voice, that lilting sweetness wrapped around every barb. Faces from the market flickered in my mind, curious, pitying, some amused. The humiliation sat low in my chest, heavy and hot. The phone in my pocket felt heavier than the apples. Alvin Brooks. I hadn't heard his name in more than a decade. Robert had trusted him once, back when we were settling the boundary dispute with a neighbor. He was sharp, methodical, and unshakable in the way he pursued a case.
Why now?
And how did he know to reach me? A gust pushed me sideways, rattling the bare branches above. I stopped in front of a small cafe, its windows fogged from the heat inside. Through the glass, I saw a couple sharing a plate of pie, their heads bent together in quiet conversation. I moved on, the bell above the door staying silent. By the time I reached Seabreeze Inn, my fingers were numb. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and the sea. I nodded to the owner behind the desk and took the stairs 2 at a time, the old wood creaking under my weight. In my room, I set the apples on the table, their skins shining in the weak light. My phone was still in my hand. I turned it over, thumb brushing the smooth edge, the message glowing on the screen. We need to talk about something important. It could be nothing. Or it could be the first real crack in the wall Leela had built around herself. I sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping under me. The radiator hissed and clanged, filling the silence. My other hand found the envelope from the gas station tucked into my bag. Sandy's words were still fresh, the memory of her voice steady and certain. Between that and this message, the pattern was starting to form. I tapped the number before I could guess myself. The dial tone rang twice before a voice came on, deep, measured, with a faint rasp that carried a weight of certainty. "Margaret, this is Alvin Brooks." And just like that, the air in the room seemed to shift. "Margaret, this is Alvin Brooks." I hadn't heard his voice in years, yet it still carried that steady confidence I remembered from Robert's stories. I sat up straighter on the bed, the phone warm against my ear. "I hope you don't mind me calling," he continued. "Your name came up in a matter I've been looking into." I glanced at the envelope from the gas station lying on the table. "What matter?" There was a pause, the sound of paper shuffling on his end. "The lottery ticket, the one your daughter-in-law redeemed a few weeks ago?" My fingers tightened on the phone. "Go on. I have reason to believe it was purchased using your debit card," he said. "From a legal standpoint, that could make you the rightful owner of the prize." The words landed like a stone dropped into deep water. First a sharp impact, then ripples spreading outward. "How would you know that? Transaction logs?" he replied. "The gas station system records the last 4 digits of the card for lottery purchases. I obtained a copy for a client unrelated to you, but when I saw your name on the register, I took notice." I stood and walked to the window, staring out at the dark harbor. The reflection of my own face stared back, pale and still. "So what does that mean?" "It means," Alvin said, his voice deliberate, "that unless you explicitly gifted that ticket to her, you may have a claim to the entire amount. $8 million minus taxes. $8 million. Hearing it out loud was different than thinking it. My mind flashed to the morning she'd told me to leave, the way Daniel hadn't met my eyes. "And if I did nothing, she keeps it all," he said plainly, "and likely believes you've accepted that." The radiator hissed in the corner. I felt a slow heat rising in my chest. Not anger exactly, but something sharper. "What would you need from me?" "Any documentation showing the withdrawal or purchase came from your account. Statements, receipts, even witness testimony. The stronger the evidence, the better our position." I thought of Sandy's steady voice at the counter, the paper in my bag. "I might have something. Then we should meet," Alvin said. "My office is still on Main Street above the hardware store. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. I hesitated, not from doubt, but from the sudden weight of possibility. $8 million was more than money. It was a reversal, a chance to pull the rug out from under Leela's neat little story. "I'll be there," I said finally. "Good. And Margaret?" His voice softened. "Don't sign anything she gives you in the meantime." I ended the call and stood for a moment, listening to the distant sound of waves breaking against the seawall. The paper bag of apples sat untouched on the table, the skins catching the light from the street lamp outside. Tomorrow, I thought, the tide might start to shift for real. The next morning, Main Street was slick with frost, the shop windows rimmed with pale light. I climbed the narrow stairs above the hardware store, my hand trailing along the cold wooden railing. The smell of dust and old paper met me before I reached the landing. Alvin's office door was open. He stood behind a desk piled high with files, his silver hair catching the weak sun from the window. "Margaret," he said, motioning me in. "Sit down." The chair was firm, the kind that made you sit straight. Alvin pushed a folder toward me. "Take a look at page 1. I opened it. There, in black and white, was the gas station receipt date, time, and the last 4 digits of my debit card. Below it, the itemized purchase, 3 lottery tickets, total $20. My breath caught. "That's the day," I said quietly. He nodded. "Page 2. I turned the page and froze. A still frame from a grainy security camera showed Leela at the counter, her hair tucked behind one ear, reaching for the tickets. The timestamp matched the receipt exactly. My fingers rested on the photo. "How did you get this?" "Gas stations archive their security footage for 30 days. I requested it before it was wiped. And the clerk, Sandy, I believe, confirmed you gave her the 20 for gas." The radiator under the window clicked, a slow rhythm in the quiet. "So this proves it? It strongly supports your claim?" Alvin said. "But we'll need more. Bank statements showing the withdrawal. Any text messages or notes that can link the money to you. If we can show you never intended the ticket as a gift, it's even stronger." I thought of the envelope in my bag at the inn, the bank statement already tucked inside. "I have some of that." He leaned back, folding his hands. "Then the next step is deciding how you want to proceed. We can approach her quietly for a settlement, or we can prepare for court. Either way, you need to be ready for pushback." The idea of confronting Leela sent a flicker of heat through my chest. Not fear, not exactly. Something closer to anticipation. If we go to court, what happens? She'll be forced to answer under oath. And the truth has a way of sounding different when it's sworn. I closed the folder slowly. The weight of the paper felt heavier than its size. This wasn't just evidence, it was a lifeline. Alvin watched me for a moment. "Margaret, I've seen plenty of cases where people walked away because it was easier. I don't think you're one of them." I met his gaze. "No, I'm not." He slid the folder back toward me. "Keep this safe. And start thinking about how much you're willing to fight for." I stood, tucking the folder under my arm. The sunlight outside had shifted, catching on the frost along the window frames. Down on the street, the harbor wind cut through the gaps between buildings, carrying with it the smell of salt and something sharper, like change. As I reached the top of the stairs, Alvin called after me. "One more thing. She doesn't know I'm involved yet. Let's keep it that way." I nodded, my fingers tightening around the folder. By the time my boots hit the pavement, I knew this was no longer just about getting back what was mine. It was about making sure she understood exactly what she had taken. The harbor wind had a way of finding every crack in the old inn's walls. Tonight, it whistled low through the window frame, rattling the glass in a slow, uneven rhythm. I lay on my back, eyes fixed on the dark ceiling, the blankets warm but my mind restless. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Leela's smile at the market, the tilt of her head, the way her voice carried over the crowd. Then Alvin's voice would cut in, measured and certain, talking about receipts, footage, and legal claims. The two images tangled together until they kept me wide awake. The smell of the sea drifted in from the harbor, mixing with the faint scent of detergent from the pillowcase. I thought of Robert. How he used to keep his voice steady even when bad news came. "Don't let someone else write your ending, Maggie," he'd say, his hand warm over mine. "Not unless you like the ending they've got in mind." I rolled onto my side, listening to the building settle around me. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard creaked under someone's weight. The radiator clicked and hissed, sending a wave of dry heat into the room before going quiet again. $8 million. The number was too big to picture, yet the injustice of it was sharp and familiar. I'd worked all my life, saved carefully, trusted the people under my roof. And here I was, lying in a rented bed while someone else spent what was rightfully mine. I tried to imagine what Leela thought now, if she even gave me a thought. Probably not. People like her didn't waste energy on what they believed they'd already won. A gull cried somewhere outside, its call long and low. I pushed the covers back and sat up. The floor was cold under my feet. The small desk by the window held a notepad and pen, courtesy of the inn. I pulled them close, the paper catching the lamplight. First, gather every scrap of evidence, bank statements, receipts, anything with dates. Second, talk to Sandy again, get her willing to put her memory in writing. Third, let Alvin guide the legal side, but be ready for Leela to play dirty. The pen moved faster as I wrote. Somewhere between the lines, my pulse steadied. The sleepless ache in my bones didn't feel like weakness anymore. It felt like the start of something that might carry me through. I set the pen down and looked at the list, the ink still wet. Outside, the wind shifted, bringing with it the faint clang of a buoy in the harbor. Maybe Robert was right. Maybe you could take back the pen before someone else finished the story. The morning came gray and sharp, the kind that smelled of salt and damp wood. I'd barely slept. Yet when the first light slid through the thin curtains, I was already sitting at the desk. The list from last night spread out in front of me. The radiator clanged to life as I pulled my suitcase onto the bed. The zipper gave a reluctant rasp. Inside, I dug past sweaters and a worn scarf to the folder I'd kept since leaving the house. Bank statements, receipts, and the envelope from the gas station. All stacked in careful order. I laid them out in a neat row, the paper cool under my fingertips. Each date, each number felt like a stepping stone, something solid in a sea that had been shifting under me for months. By 7:30, I had a fresh pile clipped together for Alvin. I tucked it into my tote bag, then reached for the phone. Sandy's number was scribbled on the back of an old grocery list. It rang twice before she answered. "Margaret, everything okay?" Her voice was warm, curious. "I was wondering if we could meet," I said. "I need to ask you about that day with the lottery ticket." She hesitated just long enough for me to hear the rustle of paper on her end.
I remember it well.
"Sure, come by after lunch. I'll be at the station." A relief settled low in my chest. "Thank you, Sandy. This means more than you know." After the call, I sat for a moment, the phone still warm in my hand. Something in me had shifted. Yesterday I'd been reacting, ducking blows, patching wounds. Today I was moving forward piece by piece. Downstairs, the inn's dining room smelled of coffee and buttered toast. I grabbed a cup to go, the heat seeping through the paper into my palms. Outside, the air was brisk, the gulls wheeling above the harbor. My boots crunched over a scattering of sand left from last night's frost. Back in my room, I ran through the list again, adding a note about calling Alvin before heading to the station. The neat columns of ink steadied me. This wasn't guesswork anymore. It was a plan. I was sliding the pen back into the drawer when my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a message from a name I hadn't seen since I left the house. "Leela, we need to talk." Today, my hand stayed on the phone, the words burning against the glass. The wind outside rattled the window, a hollow sound in the small room. Whatever she wanted, I knew it wouldn't be small talk. Leela's message stared back at me from the phone screen. "We need to talk." Today, I read it twice, then a third time, the black letters unchanging. Whatever this was, it wouldn't be a friendly chat. Still, ignoring her would only make her wonder what I was hiding. And for now, I needed her to think I was just drifting. I replied with a simple "where?" The answer came in seconds. Harbor Cafe. The Harbor Cafe sat at the end of the main street, its windows fogged with steam from the kitchen. Inside, the smell of strong coffee and fried eggs clung to the air. I spotted Leela near the back, dressed in a cream sweater that probably cost more than my month's rent at the inn. She didn't wave. "Margaret," she said as I slid into the booth opposite her. Her smile was there, but it was too precise, like it had been measured out. "Leela," I replied, setting my gloves on the table. She wrapped her hands around a mug, nails perfectly painted. "I thought we should clear the air. Things have been tense." I let her words hang in the space between us. The waitress brought me coffee without asking, a kindness I didn't miss. Leela leaned in slightly. "I don't want any bad blood. We're family after all. Daniel worries about you." The mention of my son was calculated. I stirred my coffee slowly. "I can take care of myself?" "Of course." Her tone was light, but her eyes studied me, scanning for cracks. "Still, it would be easier if we understood each other." No surprises. I met her gaze evenly. I've always preferred knowing where I stand. A flicker passed across her face, quick, almost imperceptible. "Good. Then let's agree to keep things civil." The rest of the conversation skimmed along the surface: the weather, the cost of groceries, a passing mention of someone's new boat. Beneath it, I could feel her measuring every word I said, weighing it against whatever she already suspected. When the check came, she reached for it with a smile. My treat. I thanked her, knowing she'd file that away too. Proof I wasn't flush with cash. Outside, the wind cut through my coat as I walked toward the harbor. The gulls circled overhead, their cries sharp in the cold air. I kept my pace steady, replaying every detail: the sweater, the way she leaned in, the careful drop of Daniel's name. All of it told me she was testing the ground, unsure how much control she truly had. Back at the inn, I pulled out the notepad from my desk drawer. The list from 2 nights ago waited, the ink still dark. I drew a neat line through the first item: face her without revealing intent. 1 step down, many more to go. I sat back in the chair, the pen still warm in my hand. Step 1 was done, and I'd walked away without giving her a thing she could use. The phone lay beside the notepad. I picked it up and dialed Alvin's number. He answered on the second ring. How did it go? He asked. She was fishing, I said, trying to keep it civil, but she wanted to know if I was planning anything. And you? I gave her nothing. Just small talk. There was a brief pause, then a low chuckle. Good. Keep it that way. I'll have some updates for you tomorrow, something from the lottery commission. After we hung up, I added a note under step 2: meet Sandy today. Get her written statement. By noon, I was walking toward the gas station. Sandy was behind the counter, her hair pulled back, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. She greeted me with that same easy smile. You came, she said. I explained what I needed. She didn't hesitate, pulled out a notepad from under the counter and began writing. The details matched what she'd told me before: the $20 bill, my asking her to put gas in the car, Leela using the card instead. She signed it at the bottom, pressing the pen firmly enough to leave an imprint. Thank you, I said, tucking the statement into my bag. Get her, Margaret, she replied, her eyes bright. Back in my room, I set the statement alongside the folder from Alvin. The pile was growing, solid in a way that felt almost physical. I opened my laptop and logged into my bank account. The balance was steady, but I clicked through each linked account, removing shared access wherever I found it. If Leela or Daniel thought they could reach into what little I had left, they'd find nothing but a closed door. The radiator hissed as I worked. Outside, the harbor wind rattled the panes, the sound like a reminder, steady, relentless. By evening, the list had more check marks than it had 2 days ago. Evidence gathered, access secured, allies identified. I sat at the desk, fingers resting lightly on the notepad, and let the quiet stretch out. Every move had to be careful. Every step had to be invisible until the moment came to strike. Folks, have you ever kept a secret plan, waiting for the perfect moment to act? Tell me how you handled it. Your story might give someone else the courage to make their own move. The morning sky was the color of pewter, low clouds pressing down on Main Street. I walked with my coat buttoned to the throat, the folder under my arm heavier than it had ever felt. Each step toward Alvin's office felt deliberate, measured, like crossing a bridge I could never return from. The stairs above the hardware store groaned under my boots. Alvin was already standing when I reached the doorway, a manila envelope in his hand. Morning, Margaret? He said. You ready? I took the envelope and followed him to the desk. The office smelled faintly of old paper and coffee gone cold. He slid the first document toward me, the pages crisp. This, he explained, is the formal petition to claim the lottery prize as the rightful owner. Once it's filed, it becomes part of the public record. I sat, the chair creaking under my weight. My pen hovered above the first page. The black print swam for a moment, a blur of legal phrases and dates. Then I steadied my hand and signed. Once, twice, 3 times where Alvin had marked the spots. The sound of the pen scratching across paper was louder than I expected, filling the quiet room. Each stroke felt like carving something permanent. When the last page was done, Alvin gathered the stack neatly, tapping it against the desk to square the edges. We'll have the clerk file this by the end of the day. From here, she'll have to respond. There's no avoiding it. I leaned back, letting out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. So that's it? That's the beginning, he said. We've moved from shadows into the open. Through the window, I could see the harbor masts swaying in the wind, their ropes clinking against metal. Somewhere below, a door slammed, and the echo carried up the stairwell. Alvin slid a smaller sheet toward me. This is a statement for the press. If we decide to go that route, it's optional, but it's good to be ready. I glanced at the blank lines meant for my signature.
Not yet.
He smiled faintly. That's fine. 1 step at a time. I stood, tucking my gloves into my coat pocket. The envelope was gone from under my arm now, resting in Alvin's hands, but the weight in my chest was different, lighter in some ways, heavier in others. At the door, he said, "It's official now." And for the first time in months, I felt the ground under me hold steady. The wind had picked up by the time I stepped back onto Main Street, carrying the smell of the harbor and something sharper. Like the air before a storm, my hands were deep in my coat pockets, but I could still feel the echo of the pen in my fingers. Halfway down the block, my phone buzzed. "Lila, what is this I'm hearing?" I didn't reply. The message was followed almost immediately by another. "Lila, are you trying to embarrass us?" A gull screeched overhead, and I kept walking, letting the words roll off me like the wind against my collar. The buildings on either side felt narrower, the street more like a tunnel pushing me forward. Then the call came. Her name lit up the screen, bright and insistent. I let it ring, the vibration a steady pulse in my palm. A month ago, that sound would have set my heart racing. Today, it only confirmed what I already knew. She was off balance. I stopped in front of a bakery window, the glass fogged from the ovens inside. A tray of fresh bread sat cooling, the crusts golden and cracked. The scent leaked through the doorframe, warm and grounding. I let the phone stop ringing before slipping it back into my pocket. Another message arrived.
Lila,
"We need to talk." Now, need. That was the word she'd chosen.
not want, not should.
Need. I crossed the street toward the harbor, the gulls scattering in a rush of wings as I passed. Alvin had been right. Once the filing hit the clerk's desk, the quiet would be over. Word traveled fast in a town this size, and faster still when $8 million were at the center of it. At the edge of the pier, I stood for a moment, watching the masts sway, the ropes creaking against the tide. The water below was dark and restless, but I felt steady in a way I hadn't for months. The current was finally moving in my direction. The phone buzzed again. Her fifth attempt. I silenced it without looking. Let her stew. Let her wonder what I was doing, who I was talking to, what I might do next. Every hour she spent guessing was an hour I could use to strengthen my position. Turning away from the water, I headed back toward the inn. The wind caught my scarf and lifted it, the ends snapping in the cold air. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel like I was chasing her shadow. Now she was chasing mine. The knock came just after 3, sharp against the thin wood of my door. I knew before opening it who it would be. Leela stood in the hallway, cheeks flushed from the wind, hair slightly out of place. Her coat was unbuttoned, scarf loose around her neck, too hurried to fix herself before confronting me. "Margaret," she began, the word clipped. "We need to clear this up."
Now.
I stepped aside, letting her in without a word. The radiator hissed in the corner, the only sound for a moment. She stayed standing, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room like it might reveal my strategy. "I heard you filed something with the court," she said. "Do you have any idea what that makes us look like?" I sat at the small desk, folding my hands in my lap. "I imagine it makes us look like two people who disagree." Her mouth tightened. "This is unnecessary. If you wanted money, we could have." I raised a hand slightly. "Don't finish that sentence." She stopped, caught off guard. The pause stretched, and I let it. The sound of gulls filtered in through the window, their calls rising and falling. "You're blowing this out of proportion," she tried again, her voice sharper now. "Daniel is beside himself." I met her gaze evenly. "Daniel can speak for himself." She shifted her weight, the floorboard under her heel groaning. "You don't know what you're getting into?" "I think I do," I said, my tone calm enough to make her blink. "And I'm prepared for it." Her eyes flicked to the tote bag in the corner, the one holding the folder from Alvin. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, like she'd thought better of whatever she was about to say.
"This isn't over,"
she said finally.
I tilted my head.
"No, it isn't." She turned toward the door, coat swinging behind her. For a moment, I thought she might slam it, but instead she pulled it closed quietly, the latch clicking into place. The room felt larger after she left, the air easier to breathe. I walked to the window and watched her cross the street, her steps fast, almost uneven. For months, I'd been reacting, ducking, enduring, absorbing the blows. But standing there watching her retreat, I realized the balance had shifted. She wasn't dictating the terms anymore. I was. The morning light slipped in slow, pale ribbons through the curtains. For the first time in weeks, my phone was silent. No buzzing on the nightstand, no screen lighting up with Leela's name. The stillness pressed in, not heavy but different. Measured. Watchful. I made coffee in the small French press I'd bought from the thrift shop down the block. The rich, bitter smell filled the room, mixing with the faint salt air drifting in from the harbor. Outside, gulls traced lazy arcs above the masts, their cries softer than usual, as if the whole town had lowered its voice. At the desk, the notepad lay open, the list from days ago still there, now marked with heavy check marks. Beside it, the folder from Alvin sat fat with documents, receipts, statements, Sandy's signed note. I began to sort them into neat stacks, sliding each into a labeled envelope. It felt less like defense now and more like inventory, like knowing exactly what tools I had at hand. By mid-morning, I called Alvin. He picked up quickly. "Margaret," he said. "We've got our first response from their side." And I leaned back in the chair, letting the window light warm my shoulder. "They've hired counsel, but the tone is cautious. My guess is they're not eager to go in front of a judge. That's good for us?" I smiled into the phone. "Good for me, you mean?" "Exactly, I'll keep you updated as we move forward. For now, no sudden moves. Let them make the next one." After we hung up, I stayed at the desk a while longer, running my fingers along the envelope edges, the paper smooth under my touch. Each piece was a brick in a wall I hadn't known I could build until now. Around noon, I opened the window. The air was cool, tasting faintly of brine and wood smoke from somewhere down the street. A fishing boat motored slowly out of the harbor, its wake folding into the larger rhythm of the tide. I stood there, coffee cup warm in my hands, and let the quiet settle. It wasn't the uneasy quiet of waiting for the next blow. It was the pause before something of my choosing. For months, I'd been on their terms. Now the days ahead were starting to take shape on mine. The phone rang just after 2, its sound cutting clean through the quiet. I glanced at the screen and froze for a moment. "Daniel." I let it ring twice before answering. "Hello, Mom," he said, his voice low, almost uncertain. "Is this a bad time?" "Not if you've got something worth saying," I replied, keeping my tone even. There was a pause on his end, the faint hum of background noise, maybe the kitchen at home, maybe the hum of the fridge I'd once stocked myself. "I heard about the court filing," he said. She's upset?" "I imagine she is." Another pause. "I'm not calling to argue. I wanted to hear your side." I leaned back in the chair, letting my eyes drift to the window where the harbor light flickered between clouds. "My side is simple. The ticket was bought with my money. That prize is mine." "I know what you're saying," he admitted. "I guess I can see it. But things are complicated here. Things are complicated because choices were made," I said quietly. "Not by me." He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was softer. "She's been different lately, short with me. I don't know if that's because of this or something else." I didn't push. "Daniel, I'm not here to tell you how to run your marriage. But I won't apologize for standing up for myself." "I'm not asking you to," he said quickly. I don't want this to be the last time we talk." I let that hang in the air for a moment. "That's up to you." There was a faint clatter in the background, like a dish being set down. I'll be in touch," he said finally. When I hung up, the room felt still again, but not in the same way it had before. The silence now had edges, something sharp, something unresolved. I moved to the window. The tide was pulling out, leaving dark, wet lines along the shore. A single gull stood at the water's edge, unmoving against the wind. Whatever happened next, I knew the break between us had shifted, maybe not mended, but no longer so final. The end was coming, and this time it would be on my terms. The first morning in my new home began with the sound of waves brushing the shore. Not crashing, just steady, like a long exhale. I stood barefoot in the kitchen, a mug of coffee warming my hands, watching the light creep across the water through the wide front windows. The house was small, painted the soft gray of driftwood, with a porch that wrapped around to face the harbor. The floors still smelled faintly of fresh varnish, and every room carried that clean, open scent you only get when a space is entirely yours. I'd chosen this spot because it felt like breathing room. From the porch, you could see fishing boats heading out at dawn, their wakes tracing silver lines into the horizon. At night, the only lights were the stars and the slow blink of the harbor beacon. The boxes were mostly unpacked. Cookware stacked neatly in the cupboards, shelves lined with jars of spices, and the old French press in its place by the sink. My mother's cast iron skillet hung from a hook, seasoned dark from decades of use. I took a slow sip of coffee and let my gaze drift. Months ago, my mornings had been full of tension, my steps measured against someone else's moods. Now the only schedule was the one I chose. The journey here had been a fight. Quiet at first, then sharp when it needed to be. It had cost me comfort, closeness, and more than a few nights of sleep. But looking out at the tide this morning, I knew the price had been worth it. On the counter, a small stack of recipe cards waited. Today was the first meeting of the cooking class I'd promised myself I would start. A free, open kitchen for women in town who wanted to learn new skills or maybe turn an old passion into a bit of income. There'd be aprons hanging on hooks by the door, the smell of bread in the oven, and chatter warming the corners of the room. I rinsed my cup and set it in the sink. Outside, the gulls dipped low over the water, their wings catching the sunlight. The tide was on its way in. It felt like mine, all of it. The view, the day ahead, the choices. After a long season of taking back what was stolen, I was ready to begin giving something back. By mid-morning, the kitchen was alive. The front door swung open with a gust of cool sea air, and the first women stepped in, each with a smile, a sweater against the chill, and a story tucked into the lines of her face. Evelyn, who used to run the bakery on Main Street, carried a tin of cinnamon she swore by. Ruth, a retired nurse, brought a bundle of fresh herbs from her garden. They claimed stools around the island, laying their offerings on the counter like gifts. The scent of yeast and warm sugar began to fill the room as dough rose in bowls covered with tea towels. Outside, gulls wheeled above the harbor, their cries mixing with the hum of conversation inside. Someone laughed. A bright, unguarded sound, and it rippled through the group. We talked while hands worked, measuring flour, kneading gently, brushing egg wash over braided looves. Stories surfaced like shells in the tide. A husband gone too soon, children who had moved far away, the feeling of being useful one day and invisible the next. No one had to explain too much. The nods around the table said we understood. As the first trays came out of the oven, the golden crusts crackled in the air. I passed plates, watching eyes light up at the first bite. It wasn't just the bread. It was the act of making something together, the proof, warm in their hands, that we still had more to give. When the last dish was washed and the counters wiped clean, the women lingered on the porch, looking out at the water. The tide had come in fully now, lapping against the pilings with a steady rhythm. Evelyn touched my arm before leaving. You know, Margaret, it's more than a class. I smiled.
That's the idea.
After they were gone, I stood alone in the quiet kitchen. The air still held the scent of cinnamon and yeast. I thought about where I'd been just months ago. Pushed out, dismissed, told my place had been taken from me. But here, in this small house by the harbor, I had built something new. Not just for me, but for anyone who needed to be reminded that we don't stop mattering, because someone else decides we should. The waves outside kept their pace, the sun shifting higher over the water. My life was mine again. And now it was part of something larger, a legacy made not of money alone, but of proof that we can begin again, stronger than before. In the months that followed, life settled into a rhythm that felt honest and wholly mine. The fight for the ticket had been about more than money. It was about reclaiming the right to decide my own future. Every morning by the harbor, every loaf baked in that sunlit kitchen, reminded me that no one could take that away again. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: dignity isn't given, it's taken back. People may underestimate you, write you off, or try to strip away what you've built. But that's only the end if you let it be. Quiet persistence can be louder than shouting. Preparation can be sharper than any threat. And starting over isn't about forgetting the past. It's about shaping it into a foundation for what comes next. So if the day ever comes when someone decides you no longer matter, remember they don't get the final word. You do.